Hi, today I want to talk to you about Shapiro's ideas about the proper role of a board of directors, and so a proper model of corporate governance. It's somewhere between the trust it and ignore it models that we've talked about in connection with our various models of corporate governance. Roughly speaking, he says things have been changing over the past few years. They've changed in a positive direction. They're going to keep changing, and we should trust corporations to essentially adjust their own corporate governance structures in the way that best serves their interests and the interests of society at large. In other words, there's really nothing better that we can do than take virtuous people, trust them to be making reasonable decisions, trust them to trust other reasonable and virtuous people. His reasons are a combination of those that we considered for those two particular models. So in part, it is that already these corporations are subject to very serious constraints, very serious oversight. And in fact, much more so than you're likely to get from a government through regulation or direct control as in nationalization or various other kinds of interest groups. Why is that? Because a company already has pressure exerted on it from all those interest groups. That is to say, it already has to please its customers in order to sell its product, in order to engage them in the kind of brand relationship that leads to the company profiting from those customers. The customer is not going to buy the product or engage the service unless they think that the company is doing a good job of serving their interests. The same thing is true of employees. Employees can exercise the right to leave, and indeed a company that starts misbehaving, starts treating employees badly and so on, is going to suffer a lot of turnover, is going to have serious personnel problems. Most companies want to treat their employees well simply because they realize it's very costly to train new employees, to put up with inferior employees. You want good people, you want to keep those good people happy, and so there are natural incentives for companies not only to serve their customers effectively, but to treat their employees well. The same thing is true of their suppliers. They want to treat their suppliers well so they can count on them for those good supplies. They want to be able to pay them fairly. They need reliability of delivery from those suppliers, and so they're going to try to pay their bills on time and in general be good citizens with respect to those suppliers. The same thing is true of society at large. There are all sorts of pressure groups that operate here, and not just pressure groups in the sense of community activist groups that might protest or government that might regulate. Companies succeed or fail according to their brand image. They have to define what their product is, what their values are. Those get communicated to the public, and so a company is going to thrive only if the public at large has a positive image of that company. It does that in lots of ways. Yes, by producing a good product, by treating its employees well, but also in terms of its behavior in the community. Why is it that companies sponsor Little League teams, or help out in a crisis, or volunteer their own personnel or their own products in a variety of settings where it will do social good? It's in part because they realize they succeed only to the extent that their image is one that people have a positive feeling about. And so in a free enterprise economy, there are all sorts of pressures that keep a company behaving in a way that is socially productive. The same thing is true of competition. If they start losing market share, let's say they start failing to actually serve the interests of their customers, they're going to suffer. Their competitors can move in and do a better job and steal those customers away. Suppose it's the same with their employees. They start treating their employees badly, a competitor can come and take the best of those employees. And so in general, companies have strong pressures on them, not only in the sense that they want to have a positive image that helps them sell their product, but also because competitors can come in and take business away from them if they aren't doing a good job of serving the interests of their customers, if they aren't meeting the needs of the community enough that the community has a positive impression of them, if they're not treating their suppliers and their employees well, and so on. So in short, all of those various groups of stakeholders actually already have a very significant impact on what companies do. Companies have to pay attention to them. In order to promote their own bottom lines, the company has to pay attention to what is above the bottom line, that is to say, the effect on all of those other stakeholders. This really is a version of Adam Smith's argument that in order to promote their own self-interest, companies have to take into account the self-interest of other people. They have to be concerned with the welfare of others in order to perform services for them, in order to sell them products, in order to employ them and keep them happy enough to stay employed, in order to engage business relationships with them long term, and so on. companies want and have a strong incentive to attain long-term relationships with their employees, with their suppliers, with their customers. And so there are going to be reasons for that company to want to behave cooperatively with respect to all of those groups. So already there are very powerful pressures, economic pressures, in favor of corporate good behavior. There are two huge advantages to trusting companies to do this on their own due to those competitive pressures, rather than having governments or other outside groups try to second-guess corporate decisions. The first is profitability. It is vital that a company remain profitable. If it can't remain profitable, it can't innovate. And if it can't innovate, it can't produce new products to serve people's needs even better. It can't do a good job of adjusting to changes in the marketplace. It cannot, in short, remain in existence as a company for very long. So if you look at what the most profitable companies are, or look at, for that matter, the Forbes 400 of the wealthiest people in America, the turnover is remarkable. See what the most important companies were 50 years ago. See what the most profitable companies were 100 years ago. It's a list that bears very little relationship to those now. In fact, many of the companies at the top of the list today would not have even existed 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And so things change fast. A company that cannot remain profitable, cannot innovate, cannot adapt to dynamic, changing circumstances will not survive. And that's not going to be good for employees or customers or the community. So actually, it's very important for all of the above that a company be able to remain profitable. But anybody else who tries to second-guess decisions, whether it's government or a special interest group, an environmental group, a group of employees, or whatever, people who are representing a certain set of interests, they're not going to have profitability in mind. In fact, they may well view profits as a sort of negative thing, as the company taking away from the community. Adam Smith's point of view is that's the wrong perspective. Too often I've heard business people say, well, we've done very well, now I think it's time to give back to the community, as if they've been taking from the community. But that's the wrong picture. They have been making profits because they've been serving the community. They've been giving to the community all the way along. That's why they've succeeded. A company is profitable to the extent that it actually does promote the good of the community. And so companies have been doing that all the way through, and so have individuals. The consequence of that is that the natural incentives within business in a free enterprise system are precisely to serve the interests of the community. That's how you make profits. That's what makes you a successful company and a successful business executive. So they're very powerful, positive directions that push all of these interests together. That's not to say they can't sometimes come into conflict, but in general they don't. In general, one is leading to the promotion of the other. There's another important point about innovation and about investment. That is to say, companies have a very strong incentive to invest for the future, to make decisions that are not simply going to benefit people right now, but are going to benefit people in the long run. There are issues with this. Quarterly reports are things that tend to push companies toward a shorter-term perspective. But overall, companies tend to not want to consume all the seed corn. They want to be able to gather enough profits to accumulate capital, to be able to make investments that allow them to innovate and grow and perform well in the future, serving people's needs. Governments, on the other hand, and other interest groups tend to be focused on the present. So to the extent that we shift decision-making power from corporate boards as they're currently constituted toward government agencies, toward people representing interests in the public of various kinds, whether it's environmental interests or union interests or consumer interests or whatever it is, you're going to be shifting resources inevitably from investment to consumption. What that does is benefit the present at the expense of the future. You will lose research and production. You will lose innovation. You will lose the things that are going to make tomorrow better than today. So they're very powerful reasons for allowing those decisions to be made inside companies. Companies may too often have a short-term perspective, but they have a much longer-term perspective than most of the interest groups that would otherwise exert influence on their decisions. The other crucial point is that companies need to remain flexible. Situations change very quickly. Technology changes quickly. The economic conditions change very quickly. Political situations can change very quickly. And all of that is something that companies need to be able to adapt to and adjust to very quickly. The one who cannot adjust, cannot be flexible, will not, again, survive. Well, the more outside groups have their fingers in the pie, the more cooks that are in the kitchen, the harder it is to adjust to changing circumstances. So companies, to remain profitable and keep their eye on the future, but also to remain flexible, to be able to adapt to changing circumstances, have to keep their decision-making power within themselves. To the extent that we bring in other groups and try to democratize and broaden the scope of board of directors artificially beyond what the company itself thinks is in its own self-interest, we are going to be messing with that. We're going to harm profitability, we're going to harm flexibility, we're going to be harming that corporation and its chances of survival. And so in that way, actually harming suppliers, employers, customers, and the community at large. There are two other critical points that Shapiro makes. One is about independence, and in general, who ought to be represented on boards of directors. People need expertise. To be on the board of directors of an electric utility, for example, you had better have extensive experience in the electric utility industry. If you don't, you are not going to know what you're talking about. And all too often, that's something that happens. In the course, we've talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Those who know the least tend to think they know the most. Those who know the most tend to think they know the least, or at least are very aware of all the things they do not know. Something like that applies. For a simple example of that, you might look at the comedian on HBO, John Oliver. He does spoofs on various kinds of topics. The first time I ever heard him, he was talking about soccer, and it was very funny, I thought, at any rate. Of course, I don't like soccer. I don't know much about it. So it was very easy for him to make fun of the World Cup and for me to laugh along. But the next episode I saw was one on the electric utility industry. And I immediately recognized he doesn't know what he's talking about. Yes, he's pointing out all sorts of things and laughing at them that to him look irrational. But they look irrational because he doesn't know anything about the industry. In fact, they're very good and very powerful reasons for people doing things the way they do. The problem is they're complicated reasons. It's not easy to explain them in 25 words or less. And so the people who don't really know what's going on are often going to be making decisions that are disastrous from a corporate point of view. You've got to have detailed knowledge. In short, you have to have a very high level of competence in a specific industry in order to make any positive contribution to a board, or at least to avoid making a hugely negative contribution. It is hard to find people like that. And so the thought that we can add all sorts of people to the board and we'll get a better result is often really diluted. No, you won't. You'll get a lot of people who have no idea what they're doing, who don't even know what questions to ask, let alone how to answer them, who don't understand even the fundamentals. It's as if you're going to now design rockets with a bunch of people who don't even know basic arithmetic. How are they going to do it? They may be sincere, they may care a lot about rocketry, they may love to watch airplanes and watch rockets go up, but if they can't do math, they aren't going to help you. The final point is about tension on the board. A lot of people who favor democratization say, here's the problem. Boards are too often rubber stamps. We need to get conflict on the board. We need to get people disagreeing with one another and disagreeing with management so it can play a kind of devil's advocate role and exercise effective oversight. There is a point to that. We don't want people who are simply rubber stamps, who are lapdogs, yes men. On the other hand, not only do we need people with the relevant expertise and a very high level of expertise, tension can lead to paralysis. If we have too many voices on that board, if we have too many people disagreeing about what direction to go, or what the purposes of the organization should be, what our priorities should be, and so on, nothing will ever get done. And so there's a balance here. Yes, we don't want to go to the extreme of having nothing but people who are rubber stamps, but we don't want to go to the other extreme where nobody can agree on anything and nothing ever happens. We need to have, yes, people raise objections. We need for people to be free to talk. We need for a culture to develop on a board so that people can honestly say what they think. But we also need to have enough agreement, enough consensus on basic directions and basic priorities that we can actually make decisions. And so, like any virtue, you might say, according to Aristotle, we need to try for a mean between extremes. We don't want people who rubber stamp everything. We don't want every issue to devolve into disagreement where in the end we can't decide what to do. We need to have enough consensus and enough discussion and disagreement that we can, yes, take into account all sorts of different positions, but then make decisions effectively and quickly. That's not an easy balance to achieve, but it's something that companies have a very powerful interest in attaining. They don't want yes men either. Otherwise, there's no oversight and nobody to say stop when somebody needs to say stop. That's not good for an organization, but neither is it good for an organization to find itself paralyzed and unable to react. So companies themselves have an interest in helping to find that mean. Directors have an interest in finding that mean. And so that's not always achieved. Nevertheless, it's something that is more likely if we have the people having the greatest stake in effective decision making, producing boards and structuring them and populating with the right people in such a way as to bring that about. In the end, the point is, look, you can talk structure all day long, but what really matters in the final analysis is having the right people. And that's something you have to trust boards and corporations to do on their own.